Senior Housing Planner, and Matt Kroll, Planning Services Division Manager.
Thank you, Esther. Very much appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our special work session on the climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking. I just wanted to really give kudos to the CFEC team because I think that they've had a bajillion meetings between our September commission meeting and this one. And they were willing to add this to their agenda because after the September meeting, I think we realized that there's such a huge volume of information for us to digest and comprehend prior to actually talking to one another and sort of deliberating or whatever we end up doing, kind of summarizing things, giving direction, whatever that might be in at our November meeting next week. This is a preview of that material. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve, our attorney, in just one moment, but just to be really clear, this is a work session and we are not taking public comment, written or verbal. It's really a chance for commissioners to ask questions specifically about the material, and we'll be looking at the materials you were sent last week in the packet as agenda item number 7. So they'll be going through that material, but the idea is to ask questions in a way that doesn't imply you have an opinion necessarily, if you can do that, and maybe Steve can add some light to that, but it's really not intended to do any kind of action or anything like that. We just really want to understand the material that is in the packet in anticipation of doing a fuller discussion and having public testimony in November. Well, this is November, but next week at our commission meeting. So Steve, please give us the do's and don'ts of this meeting, if you will.
Well, thank you, Chair MacArthur. I think you've just covered them pretty darn well. The idea of doing this as a public meeting the public can observe is we are, as a commission, getting information about a decision that will come before you later. So the public meeting law suggests that that's something that the public should be able to have the opportunity to track. That doesn't mean, however, that the public, as the chair noted, has the ability to provide oral or written comment for purposes of this. That opportunity comes later this month at your regularly scheduled commission meeting. And just the clarification that you're not making any decisions today. This is an opportunity to hear from staff and for the commission to ask questions and do those things which help you prepare for the upcoming public hearings and potential deliberation. So that's really all I have.
Thanks, Steve. And just to note, we did receive some written testimony that the person felt that we should share today. And in fact, if they're listening, we welcome that input. We will, if you at your direction, include it in the commission's packet for a discussion next week when we are taking written and verbal testimony. So thank you for your input. With that, unless commissioners have questions, I might just turn it over to the CFEC team. Any questions, commissioners, about today? I'm sorry, Bill. Any questions about today's proceedings? Not seeing any hands. Thank you, Bill. Sorry to plop on your words.
No, thank you, Chair MacArthur. I appreciate the time of all the commissioners today. Bill Holmstrom, co-project manager for the Climate Friendly Equitable Communities Rulemaking, along with Kevin Young. We're both here with you today, as well as a range of other staff here. Let me just look down my list here. Like Esther noted before, Matt Kroll, who's the Planning Services Division Manager, Cody Meyer, the Transportation Planner, as well as I think I saw, oh, there's Evan Manvel, Transportation Planner as well. We also have Brian Hurley, who's staff over at the Oregon Department of Transportation, has been collaborating with us very closely on the rulemaking as well. So in case commissioners have any questions about some of the connections with the work that we're doing with Department of Transportation, he's available to take those as well. So just wanted to introduce the commissioners to the folks that are going to be here today. We think this is a pretty good time to be holding this work session because it was really just last week we had our advisory committee, and it was the first one where we had the full suite of draft rules out in public for the first time. And as your staff report notes, there's 3 different divisions of rules that we're working on. Division 44, which is our metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction rules for requiring scenario planning. That's something that our advisory committee worked on quite a bit earlier this year, and you've heard a bit about earlier in 2020, late 2020, early 2021. We worked on that into the spring, and then later on this year, after the summertime, we have been working on primarily Division 12, which is the transportation planning rules and amendments to those, as well as some small tweaks we're making to Division 8, which are the housing planning rules, mostly around our climate-friendly areas. So that's kind of big picture where we're coming from, and now we've got at least drafts of all of those pieces. Everything that we intend to send out. Now, of course, over the next 6 months or so, we expect that we're going to be making a number of revisions and changes, and along with stakeholder comments and input, as well as our discussions with you and the commission. So we don't have a highly structured agenda for this work session, and so I'm happy to kind of just walk through our staff report for next week's meeting, if you think that's kind of the best way to kind of structure this, and then we can talk about other things that may not be on the agenda or on the staff report if you're interested.
I think I'm seeing people say yes. So yeah, take us through the staff report. That'd be great. If that works.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to ask Kevin if there's anything else that he would like to say before we kind of kick off here.
Thanks, Bill. No, I think you've summarized it well. Good morning, everyone. I do want to make sure we do have a few questions from Commissioner Warren, one of our commission liaisons, along with Commissioner Lilac, that I definitely want to address today. But I think maybe it's best to go over the staff report first, and then we can get to some of those questions.
Great, yeah, and so thank you, Kevin. The first thing in your staff report is a few pages on the Interagency Directors Panel that you'll be holding as part of our agenda item next week. And I think that's another good reason for having this work session, is because that is going to take a chunk of your time next week in your commission meeting, and you'll have less time to have the staff speak with you. So that's a good opportunity for today. I don't know that we need to go over that a lot today. This is really about implementation of the rules. We need to get the rules right over the next few months, and we need to do some calibration and tweaking and changing and making sure that we get them right. But we are hearing more and more and more, as people are understanding what the rules entail, what they're gonna, what we're talking about here is the universe of the rules, that they're going to need, especially local governments are going to need support, money, technical assistance in order to implement these things, and that's going to be critical to actually making these things work on the ground. So great opportunity, I think, for the commission to speak with directors of other agencies about how the state as a whole is going to support local governments in doing this work. And this is a beginning of a conversation that we're going to be having for, I think, a long time in order to make these things work. Anything else any other staff would like to add, or any questions or comments from the commission on that piece of it?
I would defer to commission commissioners, certainly, but just a scheduling note, the Oregon Transportation Commission meets at the same time as the Land Conservation and Development Commission regularly. We've managed to make them on the same or similar days. So Director Strickler is going to come over hopefully on time. I know he hopes that, and his staff hope that, but a little bit out of his hands with respect to his commission. So Amanda Peets is available to be back up, and we may need to just invite Director Strickler to go first after our director's opening, or otherwise sort of juggle that. But I just wanted to note that conflict. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. As that gets closer and we have a better sense of when Director Strickler's availability is, why don't you just give me a text or something, and we'll make sure that he is offered the prime time relative to his commission.
Thank you so much.
Great. So thank you. So moving on in the staff report, the next thing we talk about is, we give an overview of what we've been up to. And we've provided a table there, and it's kind of an ongoing thing we've been doing over the last year-ish or so in our LCDC staff reports of all our advisory committee meetings. And it has a link to, details of the packet that we give each advisory committee, as well as the video recording for if you want to get the popcorn out and watch one of those meetings. We want to do that, but and then kind of a short summary of what we talked about. Now, at the time this your staff report went out last week, it was just before our next meeting, which we have since held. It was on Friday. Frankly, I think 3 of the 4 commissioners here were at that meeting, or at least were at the meeting yesterday where we talked about the meeting. So, Vice Chair, hello. If you have any questions or would like to have hear about how the meeting last week went, I'm happy to provide that for you.
Are you saying right now?
If you'd like to, yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm just listening along. I'm drinking tea, so I'm turning off my camera, but I'm here.
That's no problem. Yeah, I just want the Chair MacArthur was at the meeting, as well as Commissioners Warren and Leland, because there are liaisons. So I don't want to necessarily repeat a lot of things that the commissioners have were in those meetings or talking about. So would another staff person like to spell me for a second and talk about how RAC meeting 9 went?
Kevin, are you available?
Sure, you bet. So yeah, we had our first 4-hour meeting, which was something. I think actually went pretty quickly for many of us. We, as Bill mentioned, we're rolling out finally the full suite of rules, and so spent quite a bit of time talking about transportation system performance measures. We talked about street and roadway improvements requirements, as those were kind of the new pieces of rules, as well as the revisions to rules for climate-friendly areas and for parking and electric vehicle charging. So a lot of new stuff. I thought it was people were pretty engaged, pretty interested in what we had to say. I will say, I think we had maybe a little less engagement from some of the interest groups that are represented on the RAC. And unfortunately, we're kind of heading into more technical terrain. And so one of our challenges moving forward is to make sure that as we're explaining these rules, we do a good job of kind of providing the real world context of what these rule changes would result in. So that's a challenge that we'll try to address in the future. But I think it was a very successful meeting. We continue to get a lot of feedback. One of the things that we will be exploring is topic-centric work groups. So we'll be soliciting interest from rulemaking advisory committee members in kind of meeting in smaller work groups to address, for example, say climate-friendly areas or performance measures, or a variety of topics based on people's interests and concerns or what have you. So that will be interesting as we move forward.
Can you remind me? Do you have technical groups that are working on this work, or is it just the one RAC? I can't remember.
It's just the one RAC. Yeah, unlike the housing work where we had three tax technical advisory committees as well. This is really just the one RAC thus far. We have had a few. Let's see. We had the performance measures group spinoff. We had, I think, also some meetings focused on sort of refining the equitable outcomes statement as well. But for the most part, it's been the large group.
I think Evan has held a few on parking as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
So just in commissioners, I don't know if it's important, this is Kirsten, apologies for breaking in if I may, Chair MacArthur, but just on the on the staffing and the stand up of this, the advisory committee flow on this process. We're all in the front seat and very interested about how this is going. And this certainly was an experiment to have such a large rack. We thought it was warranted. I advocated for it. So if anyone's to blame, you bring it here. Bill wanted a nice small rack and was very patient with me as we tried to cover the geography of seven metropolitan areas in terms of the diversity of the communities, obviously other interest groups needing to be represented, local governments. We didn't have the new staff that we had with the housing team. And granted, that was an incredible effort, one rack, three very, basically 4 racks, 1 rack, 3 sub racks, 3 tacks. And in this case, just because folks are cutting into their already scheduled work, I decided to go with this one and the work groups as format. And we certainly don't have an opinion now, and that's not the purpose of today, but we're all interested, and I think several of the commissioners and the commissioner liaisons are interested in the debrief on this, and just to think, what worked, what didn't, and what we can learn going forward. But no, there was no standing technical advisory committee. There's also the Interagency technical support team, which is bringing you the panel and movements of that nature, but no technical TAC per se, for better or for worse. Thank you.
And just, I think, Kevin, were you done? I didn't want to.
Yeah, I was done. Thanks.
Okay. So, and as Kevin pointed out, the staff is recognizing that there are some things to do differently, not in addition to doing a sort of a not a call mortem, it's not going to be a dead body here, but a review of how to do this and what we've learned, lessons learned. Staff is jumping into the idea of doing these other kinds of things to do outreach. So the focus work groups, it was what Kevin and I think Bill mentioned, and that's a good thing for some of the practitioners that really need to understand how this is going, how they, when it gets to their hands, how they will implement that. We also talked about some other ideas of doing some one-on-one calls, and I think staff is doing that with some of the stakeholders that they glaze over at the eyeballs when they see all this detail, rightfully so, because they don't have to implement it. They just want to have the outcome be the right outcome. So I believe staff is in the right place to do some of that outreach, and I'm encouraged by that. Any observations from Commissioner Lilac or Warren that you think is useful for the group? Well, I think we'll go into more detail next week, but if you have any observations about where the work groups are and that sort of thing, and where we are in this effort, that I think it'd be useful for the commission to hear that as we go into our conversations next week at the commission meeting.
And Chair, if I may, we will have a better idea next week about where our advisory committee, where their preferences are in terms of which topics they would like to cover. So we'll be able to discuss that next week.
Great, perfect.
Catherine, Bill, could you just also describe the regional workshops with practitioners coming up?
I will try. So we are also holding, in addition to topic-specific work groups around specific issues in the rules, we're also going to be holding geographically focused workshops, or I guess meetings with folks around the state in the metropolitan areas, particularly the practitioners, the planners who are going to be working on implementing these issues. And frankly, we've been doing this all along with particular jurisdictions that are interested and we've been talking with. And I've held 2 separate meetings yesterday with different places. So this is something we've been doing all along, but we are going intentionally out to make sure that we're talking with everybody in every part of the state that's going to be affected.
Chair MacArthur?
Sure.
Thank you. The only other piece I would add to the meeting on Friday, which was great, and this is really genuinely to staff's credit, is the meeting really, I think, demonstrated how staff is listening to all the feedback that's being provided, and the rules are evolving. They've been evolving since August, and they have since then. And I think staff did a really nice job of explaining what has changed and continued to encourage input as we go forward, because now we're all in the details here with the local governments in particular, but with everybody. So I think, Kevin didn't mention that, and as staff, I can understand probably why not. You don't want to give yourself credit, but I want to give you credit because you all deserve the credit for continuing to listen and amend the rules as we listen to the input. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Stuart, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I just want to reinforce what Nick said. I mean, I can't say enough how great staff have been at listening. And this is a huge process and a very technical rulemaking process as well. And they've been really, really great at making the case that, these rules are going to change and that's what we expect them to do. And that we want to work with jurisdictions to change them in ways that are meaningful for those jurisdictions, but still have the outcomes we're looking for. And I think that's really crucial because this is going to be a major change for a lot of these places. A lot of them haven't done this kind of work yet, or if they have, they're just now kind of starting to. So I think working with them is going to be a crucial piece as to how we actually make the change we're looking for versus just saying this is how it has to be, kind of getting their buy-in through the process, I think, is a really important aspect.
Thanks, Stuart. And I just might add, of course, kudos to staff, but in particular, this is such a grand effort, a really good effort, but grand effort. And we talk a lot about integrating land use and transportation and economic development. And we talk about that. And then in the past, we've talked about it, and then we've gone to one particular set of rules. And in this case, staff is working on many fronts. They're working on transportation, on housing, and the scenario planning rules, divisions of rules. And in addition to that, remember, just a year ago, we passed all that House Bill 2001 stuff, and the local jurisdictions are scurrying to respond to that. So, and that's an integral piece of how we meld these things together to get the right places on the ground. So it's a historic moment, I think, for the commission and staff to be dabbling in or engaging in all those different rules. And it's hard enough for staff. You can imagine the local jurisdiction saying, well, I'm in the middle of implementing House Bill 2001. What do I do with this new stuff? So those are the kind of questions that are coming up, rightfully so. So it's a sea change, not just in terms of our work on climate writ large, but in terms of what that means in terms of the local jurisdictional effort. It's a really big lift on their part as well. So I think we're really going to be pursuing resources across the agencies, as well as from the federal government, to help with locals do that work.
I think that's why it's since all of the folks in our department know both of those efforts to talk and to make sure we're talking internally and solving some of those problems before, rather, you know what I mean? It's pre-solve them before they get to the city. Like, how would you implement that and that, right? Because the expertise is in-house.
The other thing I think I should tack on too is, we're getting some really, really great questions from the jurisdictions. They're highly technical in nature, which tells me that they're paying attention to this process, which is great. I feel like a lot of times these processes go forward and then, here's the rules and everyone's like, wait, what? Like, we had no idea this was happening. But the fact that, there are so many folks who are choosing to be engaged in it is really great.
Great. With that, send it back to staff to work, take us through this packet.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. So the next thing we talk about in the staff report is our schedule for rulemaking. At your last commission meeting, you extended the end date of when we expect to adopt these rules to May of 2022. That extra couple months where we've basically rejiggered the schedule starting from when you did that in September through the end of this year and into next year. So to give us a little bit more time to make sure that we're having these important conversations. I think immediately that's given us the opportunity to give us 2 weeks ahead of the last advisory committee meeting to put the packet out, which I think didn't necessarily hear anything from people, but I think it was probably appreciated that there was a little bit more time to review that packet ahead of that advisory committee meeting. So we're going to continue to make that our goal for the remaining advisory committee meetings. We're adding an additional advisory committee meeting, so we'll have our 10th one in December, and then we've decided we are going to do an 11th one in January as well, ahead of when that the draft rules will go to the commission for your review. And I think we talked about everything else I was going to talk about, which was the meetings that we're going to be holding with folks around the state over the next few months here. I was going to talk about that, but I think we already covered that. Yeah, I don't have any other questions about the schedule.
I don't. Oh, Nick, yeah.
I just ask one question just about the schedule. Just as I look at it, it looks like we have our hearings in March, on March 31st and April 1st. So perhaps I just didn't remove the March 17th and 18th meetings off my calendar, but those meetings have all been moved back a couple of weeks. Is that, am I correct?
Yes, that's Commissioner Lee. That's my understanding. So there's rules around when the rules have to be posted with the Secretary of State 21 days in advance of the first hearing, and the fact that that meeting was scheduled for right before spring break meant that we would have had to have posted the rules in a month earlier in February. So that probably wasn't a deal breaker, but it just makes it gives us a lot more time to dot our I's, cross our T's before we send those things in.
Sounds great. I just want to make sure I got it on my calendar accordingly. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to be very clear, and Cassandra is here as well, so she can tell me where I'm maybe misstating things. But once we've sent those draft rules into the Secretary of State and they're published, that doesn't mean that we can't continue to make changes, and that what the commission will adopt will be different from that. That's okay. It's just that we're putting that out there as the formal notice that we are moving forward with rulemaking, and we have to be specific about which rules we expect to change or amend or add. But other than that, I think it's we have some flexibility there.
Sarah, do you want to add anything to that?
Bill covered it just fine.
Thank you. Great.
So unless there's any other questions about the schedule, I think we'll press on. The next piece of the staff report is an update of how the rule drafting is going, and we talk about one thing that we added here was a kind of a callback to remember when we did the equitable outcome statement. So we brought those outcomes that came out of the equitable outcome statement, and we put those in the staff report just to kind of center us and remind us of what we're trying to get at here with these rules. And the way the equitable outcome statement is written, it has 3 principal equity outcomes, which are those 3 things there, and then 5 additional equity outcomes, and then there's, I think it's 3 climate outcomes as well in that equitable outcome statement. So we just put those in there to refresh our memories, kind of center us and remind us of what we're trying to get at with doing these rules. And it's something, I've been referring to the equitable outcome statement from time to time when I'm trying to figure out certain problems with the rules and which is the right direction to go. And it's been useful in that context. And I think we'll continue to use it as we develop our guidance and implementation as well.
So Bill,
oh, sorry, Chair.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Is there a moment where you go point by point, with all of those equity outcomes, and then go back at all of the rules and kind of identify where those have been met or not met? Or
Chair MacArthur, Vice Chair Holub, I think that would be a useful exercise. It's not something that I think I haven't done that myself. Maybe as a staff we can sit down maybe at some point and do something like that. I don't know, Evan, what do you think? You have anything to add to that?
No, I think that would be a useful exercise, as you say, and we've certainly been doing that, as Bill said, bit by bit. But a universal recheck of our work would be great, particularly engaging our partners who help develop the the rules in doing that. And we did, I would say we did contract with a disability rights consultant to look at the rules and how they're serving people with disabilities specifically. So that's a contract I would note.
Yeah, it'd be good to know, because like you might, I'm making up, you might discover one of those points is not, there's nothing now meet there, right, for one of them, or one of, you know, one's been fulfilled a lot and the other one's not so much. And I think it's good. It's sort of like how people do scorecards, you know, and rating systems. Like it keeps you honest about what you're doing, because you're like, did I get the points, or did we not get the points? And I think that's a chance to find anything that you might need to correct before then. But then I think it's also a good tool to communicate potentially outward, to be like, this was our goals, this is what we did, and this is how they align. Because yeah, there's a lot of talk about equity, but and that they sound great. And you might discover through the process that maybe they were written too generically, or maybe they were written too specifically. And I just wouldn't know unless that was done, the analysis was done.
Chair MacArthur and Bill, if I could just add on for Vice Chair Halova, great exercise, not just exercise, great, and you know, assessment that we'll do in that regard. I just can't help but give a shout out to Evan and others, Evan, Kevin, and Cody, who developed a memo just in September on this topic, and it went in the RAT 8 packet. But Esther, I might suggest that we include it with Commission's supplemental packet. It's a 5-page memo on how the rules are addressing equity. So Vice Chair Halova, they didn't do the point by point underneath, you know, the annotation per the outcome. But it does, it's quite in depth on how equity is incorporated in the rules in each major category: scenario planning, spatial equity analysis, climate friendly areas, parking reform. So it's a good start, but not to say we shouldn't do the, you know, let's go back through the fine tooth comb and kind of annotate that. But I'd like to make that document available for commissioners' reference at this meeting as well, if we could.
Yeah, and I was thinking very much in that word annotate, in the sense if there's like a section 0, 1, whatever, that you could just say this is fulfilled through these different sections, not write a story about it, but somebody could go this and they can look at that and just give a sense of that. Yeah.
Good. We love the term crosswalk as well. So thank you. That's a really great suggestion.
Yeah, I like those ideas, and I realized that I had the benefit of seeing that memo that staff produced that was very helpful for a previous RAC meeting. And I think you're right, Kirsten, that it hasn't been distributed to the full commission. And sort of along the same lines, and maybe Anjali captured it better than I will, but there's this lens, there's this equity lens, and then we have our desired outcomes for equity and climate friendly. And then, and I understand that, but then there are measurements. I'm assuming that we will evolve measurements to demonstrate progress, or to demonstrate whether or not the communities are making progress, both individually and collectively, toward those outcomes. And I have not read your draft, I have to say. I apologize, but I have not read through your entire draft. Maybe that is in there, maybe that's coming, but perhaps you could reflect on if that's what you're thinking of doing or have done, or is it even useful? I just don't know yet.
Yeah, Chair MacArthur, thank you for that question. So we do have a mechanism for ongoing monitoring and reporting, and I think I'll hand it over to Cody Meyer to speak to that.
Good morning, commissioners. Cody Meyer with the department. Chair MacArthur, in rules 900 through 915 in the TPR draft is the performance-based planning framework, which sets requirements for minor annual reports that are kind of more qualitative for folks to make, you know, what are we up to, kind of just keeping score of what's going on. And then every 4 or 5 years, depending on when their metropolitan planning organization does a federal RT regional transportation plan, we're requiring a major report. And the major report kind of collates these minor reports, but also includes some quantitative information on outcomes. And so these are all action-based, what performance measures are being tracked at the city level, but kind of rolled up into a regional look to say, how are we doing on track to not only our equitable outcomes, but also our greenhouse gas performance targets. So if you region has a scenario plan, they would track to the outcomes in that scenario plan. So when they kind of come in, they say, this is how we define success. And here's the performance measures and targets we'd like to use. For regions that don't have a scenario plan, we have the STS trajectories. So where our basically regional actions should be going out to the year 2050. And those really kind of set the direction and magnitude of some of these local actions to take. So we're going to be supporting local governments with gathering that information and giving them that to set performance targets for low stress traffic networks for bike and pedestrian mode of travel or transit service per capita, those kind of things.
That's very helpful, Cody. And I was thinking maybe, and I think you already have a graphic now that as you were talking, I was thinking about the community conversations last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever they were. There's a graphic that sort of depicts that. And I'm wondering if next week, as part of the commission meeting, so we can see sort of the whole picture, if it works for you to put that in the presentation so we understand the lens, the desired outcomes, and sort of the process in a conceptual way about how we measure progress, something like that. But I think you already have that graphic. Hopefully I'm not asking you to recreate the wheel here.
That's great. We'll make sure to include that.
Any other questions about sort of the frame? I don't think, Bill, you went into the specifics of housing rules, transportation rules, and scenario planning. Is that what your intention is after we kind of get our head around the process?
If you would like, we absolutely could do that.
Any other commissioners? I don't want to cut anything off. Questions, clarity relative to this? Okay, seeing no hands. Thank you, Bill.
So they're in numerical order by division in your packet, and the first one is Division 8, which is our housing rules. I'm going to hand that over to Kevin to just speak real briefly about what we're doing there.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. That's a good question. So some key changes to the housing rule from the last draft that we saw. So let me think through this. I'm looking at a slide here, just kind of summarizing that.
So what you're seeing on the screen is a little bit outdated, to be honest with you. It's from RAC meeting 8.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but yeah, there's our staff report. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep. So Kevin, even in that, it's on page. If Esther, if you're navigating, please go to page 7. Item 1 is the housing rules, and that's what commissioners have in front of them. Kevin, you might sing off that page if you don't mind.
No, not at all. Okay, so essentially what the housing rules will do is require cities with a population above 10,000 to include information on housing within climate-friendly areas in there as part of their housing capacity analysis updates. So the cities would evaluate housing production, identify strategies to support that housing, just general housing and affordable housing within climate-friendly areas. As part of the housing production strategy reports. So in this draft of rules, we've clarified how this would work in the Portland metropolitan region. That was a little bit in question. And so essentially, the latest draft would require those cities, population over 10,000, to report on housing production within town and regional centers as part of the climate-friendly, climate-smart communities work. So that's happening every 6 years within the Portland metro region. Other areas are required to do, as you know, based on the requirements of House Bill 2003. Cities over 10,000 elsewhere in the state are required to update their housing capacity analyses and then produce housing production strategy reports every 8 years. And so as part of that work, those cities within the metropolitan areas would also be reporting on housing production within climate-friendly areas. One of the goals for this provision is not just to report, but also to build a body of knowledge about tools that are working, what's working in different cities, to try to get the kind of development we need to see, both affordable and market rate. We know it's a shift. We're trying to facilitate the kind of development we need to see in these urban areas. And so I think it'll be very interesting. And I think we'll be able to share information with other local governments at appropriate scales, because as we know, there's a big difference between, say, the housing market in the Portland metropolitan region versus the housing market in Southern Oregon. So we're very excited about these rules. Another key change in the housing rules from the last version is in relation to urban growth boundary expansions. So the prior draft essentially established a date after which local governments would need to actually achieve 30% of housing units within climate-friendly areas to be able to expand urban growth boundaries. We got a lot of comments on that, and rightly so, concerns that an unintended consequence of that would be potentially raising housing costs in these areas, and that's definitely something we don't want to create. So the challenge is, how do we get cities to build differently than they have in the past? And so the revised provision essentially would say that for those local governments that have identified a need for additional residential lands for their growing population beyond the scope of their current urban growth boundaries, in conjunction with an urban growth boundary expansion, they would then need to designate a portion of the land within the UGB for additional climate-friendly areas, basically to accommodate half of the identified housing need within climate-friendly areas, which could be in the expansion areas or could be elsewhere in the local government's jurisdiction, wherever that makes the most sense. So that's.
Can I ask for clarification? You said if they have a certain housing need and then they decide to add more UGB area, that housing need, they need to think of 50% of that being in somewhere in their city, a new area of climate-friendly area that they've defined.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stuart?
Yeah, and I just want to point out, just in case it's not entirely clear, that you can have multiple CFAs, climate-friendly areas within an urban growth boundary. So you can think of them as like little hubs. And I think that's something that we really need to really up our communication on, because I think there's still a little bit of confusion around that.
I think that's a really good point, because I was thinking initially early in the process that there was just one big CFA, and I really appreciate your point. I think it would be useful to reflect on that at the fuller commission meeting with the public involved. Thank you.
And that goes in line with like TOD zones, that have kind of sprung up in other places that are not the CBD of a city. Makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Nick, I'm being informal. Hopefully that's okay with you guys. It's a work session, so I'll call you just Nick.
Great, thank you. Well, I just want to echo the comments about the UGB expansions. And again, Kevin, this again demonstrates, I think, that how well staff is listening to the comments and issues that are being raised. I certainly hear about it regularly here in Central Oregon with the rapid growth, and what we don't want to do is artificially constrain supply by just focusing housing in certain areas that may take a long time, 5 to 10 years, to redevelop, to consolidate parcels in urban renewal areas, things of that nature. So thank you again for this, and I agree with Chair MacArthur. I think this does deserve some airtime or some discussion time at our full meeting, is that we will have more people that listen and are really keenly aware of this issue and interested in it. Thank you.
You bet. If there aren't further questions, I think we can move on.
Great.
So thank you, Kevin. We'll move on to Division 12 of the Transportation Planning Rules. This is this is a large piece of what we're doing here. Is going to live within Division 12 and inside the transportation planning rules. We're giving kind of a high level overview of the pieces here in the staff report, but I think, as you all know, there's quite a bit of detail there. You know, in our draft packet, the draft rules are in the advisory committee packet. The draft rules are for this division are 101 pages. Some of that is explanatory text and things like that. About 35 pages of that are existing rules where we're making changes, and some of that is just pages and pages of just repeating stuff that we're not changing at all, just because we need to be complete. So it's not quite as bad as 101 pages, but we are we're adding a lot. Or basically the way it's working is we are forking it into kind of two different paths. And there's going to be kind of the existing rules, which will continue to apply to jurisdictions outside of the metropolitan areas. For those places, things aren't changing. They're going to stay the same. But we're basically taking all the rules that apply within metropolitan areas and creating kind of a whole new track where we expect things to be quite different in how folks will be completing their planning. As you can see, the bullet points there are kind of the high level of what we're expecting to do, making sure we're centering underserved populations both in how we make decisions and in how the outcomes of those decisions and what those look like. And we can talk in detail about that if you're interested. What Kevin was just talking about, creation of the climate-friendly areas, the pedestrian-friendly places where compact mixed-use development is allowed and encouraged. Prioritizing investment in high-quality, connected, and safe pedestrian, bicycle, and transit networks. We're doing that through a couple different ways. Really, this is not something. This is something that's obviously required now, is to plan for these types of things. But I think we're really trying to turn up the volume on that level of planning. Make sure that we're really looking for high-quality networks that really are going to be useful for people to be able to live their daily lives without having to drive a car. We made it very easy for people to drive a car right now, right? And those are a result of choices that, that society and government have made over decades. We need to turn around, do a 180 and really think about, we've got that figured out. We need to figure out these other ways of getting around to and give people the freedom to live their lives without having to drive a car. A big piece of that is right-sizing parking requirements, and if we've done quite a bit on parking, and Evan would be happy to answer any questions on that, I'm sure. And then the last one there is changing the methods of planning for transportation, including the standards which we use to determine success or failure. That's essentially where we're looking at the standards that folks use to make decisions. And right now, many of those decisions are based on just motor vehicle congestion and whether, how many cars can move through an intersection during a peak hour or something like that. And trying to broaden those and make sure that we're talking about safety, accessibility of goods and services, and connectivity. Lots of different values that we're trying to accomplish with our transportation system, not just moving cars. So that's really super high level. Like I said, there's a lot of detail in there, and we can talk about that, for many work sessions, I'm sure. But I'm happy to answer any questions in general or specific, of course.
Thanks, Bill. Stuart, and then Nick.
Thanks, Bill. Of course, I've got a lot of questions here. First one is, are we making any requirements for connecting multiple CFAs? So are we saying you have to have high quality pedestrian infrastructure connecting these different nodes, or is there anything in the rules about that?
Thank you, Commissioner Warren. So I don't know that we specifically say connect all the climate friendly areas, but we do talk about, I'd say particularly with transit and on our bicycle network, that there's a network of connected facilities or services that connect key destinations. And we're looking at the list of key destinations, climate friendly areas. I don't know if it's the first one, but it's up there near the top. And of course, there's a range of other places that are important to connect to as well that people are going to be using. But we know that we want to put a lot of people and the places that they want to go to in climate friendly areas. So we use that as a good kind of catch-all for a great key destination. So we want to make sure that we're connecting those key destinations to each other, and for people that live outside of climate-friendly areas to be able to connect to key destinations, including inside and outside climate-friendly areas as well. So not necessarily specifically like you're saying, but in a general sense, absolutely.
Okay, and my next question is about the safe pedestrian infrastructure, so especially bicycle infrastructure. So when we say safe, are we saying that if they just have a painted line on the road, is that qualifying as safe, or what does safe mean in this regard?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Warren. I think we're still trying to figure out exactly, when you give the example of the bicycle infrastructure, we know that separated and protected bicycle facilities, especially on larger streets, are what attract more bicycle riders and are certainly perceived as safe and have a lot. They're safer than just a painted line. And we are requiring those on the arterials within climate-friendly areas. That's something that's in our draft rule right now, and we frankly received some pushback in order to get that in there. But we thought it was important. And now we're hearing from communities that that's not even enough, that they'd like more. I think we're still trying to calibrate exactly, what the right balance is there. We are saying that on arterials, there's no place where you can have just a stripe. You have to have at least what we call a buffered bike lane, where you have two stripes. They're separated. It's a little bit more room. But really, when it comes to cycling, we want to make sure that the treatment is, it reflects the facility. So, if you're on a small, narrow local street, you don't necessarily need to have a bike facility. You're fine. And you need to be able to have that range of options. The more traffic there is, the faster it's going, the busier it is, the more protection that you're going to need. And you need to have that kind of flexibility in order to do that. And so it's a fine line in the rules to figure out where's the right balance between making sure that we really are moving in the right direction, putting facilities on the street that are going to get people on bicycles that are maybe don't feel like it's safe today, rightfully so, without being overly prescriptive. And we're trying to hit that balance.
Thanks. I'm just picturing, how this is going to play out in the real world, right? So if we have these separated, bike lanes in the CFAs, then when that arterial collector hits the boundary of the CFA, does it just stop, or what are we really expecting for these jurisdictions to do with kind of that area? So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, a good question.
I think that's all the questions I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you. I'm going to phrase this as a question. I probably have pretty strong opinions about it, but and I'm looking at the right rule as I ask these questions. In the 0330 land use requirements, which is beginning on page 63 of our CFEC packet. I guess my question is, I understand the point that we're trying to create high quality corridors. My question is it necessary that we include so many specific urban design and almost architectural standards in the rule that communities must then adopt? And from front yard and side yard setbacks must be limited to 0. Buildings must be designed to face the street with direct pedestrian access. We talk about street trees, and it's not just street trees, but it's really getting into the details there. So I'm really interested in the thoughts on this. If these aren't better suited for either a guidance document or for a model code or something, because I get the intent of high quality, but I just really question the level of detail. And then I've got one more question after this, but I just put that question out for any response or thought.
Certainly, yeah. I'll talk about Rule 330 for a second here. So the starting point with Rule 330 are existing rules in Rule 45 of the Transportation Planning Rules, which, I'm sorry, yes?
I'm so sorry. This is Kirsten, and I think that for sure we are on firm ground here, Commissioner Lilac, and you run these meetings all the time and work sessions, and I know you know. I'm quite confident you just asked for clarification about why we'd be going so specific. But just a reminder to folks that we're not deliberating today, that we would take up alternate strategies during our LCDC meeting on Friday. But thanks, sorry for the PSA.
I'll try to be informative. So Rule 330 is an evolution that came out of thinking about Rule 45 and the existing rules, which I think probably is pretty prescriptive itself. Obviously not maybe to the level of some of the prescriptions that are in Rule 330. I mean, we're trying to take the next step on top of what we already require. So I would say, a lot of how the rules have evolved over time have been going pretty far and then kind of coming back a little bit more and reducing some of the detail over time as we have some more discussions with folks. And maybe 330 hasn't quite made that trip back yet. And so I think we're happy to have discussions with stakeholders about it. It hasn't come up a lot that we've talked with people. Maybe it's just kind of hiding there a little bit, or maybe it's just, we haven't really brought that up as a discussion item at an advisory committee meeting. So, we'll see what happens. Maybe we can have a topic-specific work session on this one. And I agree, there's definitely a high-level specificity in that rule, and maybe it needs some tweaking for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Which is why I wanted to ask that for the question, just to understand the thinking and the reason why it's in there, rather than expressing an opinion, just really asking the question. The second question I have, and I'm not sure if it's this set of rules, I just have this whole packet, is in some cases, are we thinking about, or have you thought about some of the terms that we're using, such as comfortable? We want to create a comfortable pedestrian space, or significant, or I just think about communities could very well, I think this goes back to Vice Chair Halaba's comment earlier, let's think about implementation. Because I can see communities coming back and asking the department and DLCD staff. So in some areas, it's clear what the department's thinking about in terms of what a high quality pedestrian corridor looks like, because the standards are here. In other cases, how do we define comfortable? How do we define significant? Some of those terms, I just kind of jumped out at me. I'm just, if you're thinking about how we might define those or how you might respond. And that concludes my comments or questions for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll have to give some thought to some of those places where it's a little more ambiguous.
So I was thinking that next week, this is, I think, a good idea. It's helpful. This conversation is helpful because it maybe articulates some of the things that staff does want to bring up next week. And I think it'd be very useful. I mean, Nick, you might ask the question again next week, which is great. But maybe proactively talk about the staff's why the staff, like you just did, Bill, why it was important to go to specificity, and kind of lay that out because I think we'll get some comment, I suspect, in public comment on that. So I think it helps to educate, especially for the other couple commissioners that aren't here today, that where you're coming from, and that way it also gives an entree to the public to come in and comment on that. So we'll be more educated. Great. Stuart, do you have another question?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to Nick's question. What is the thinking behind the street trees requirement? I mean, I think I know in the back of my head, but I want to kind of bring that topic up because I think it's a really important aspect of climate equity stuff.
Bill, Chair MacArthur, Bill, do you want me to, since I'm often hammering at this, take the blame here, but and I know Kevin has opinions, having administered programs in local government with street trees design standards. I turned over there, but it really goes back to that equitable outcome statement, Commissioner Warren. And so I'm actually going to flip to the statement myself on page 6 of our staff report. Even the second one, the accessible, safe, and affordable, equitable transportation options that are connectivity to destinations people want to reach. Just thinking about the raising temperatures and trying to make a comfortable pedestrian environment, frankly, in really so many of these metropolitan areas. Specifically, the additional outcome, is listed there. Number 5 is equitable access to welcoming parks, nature, open spaces, and public spaces. But it's a little bit different. For me, it was different for that. It's trying to keep, they're related, but the street tree for me is trying to keep the pedestrian environment humane with refuge for people in shade where folks can. And I am far from an expert. I'm not an expert on street tree ordinances. I know there are many, many local governments in Oregon that have researched this extensively and have great ordinances. So we don't mean to usurp that at all, but it's just, again, to get that comfortable pedestrian environment to encourage people to be able to walk. Access to, tree canopy and with relation to global warming is actually kind of a different matter for me. This is just about comfort and equity, frankly, because we know that, honestly, that here where I live in Portland, more affluent neighborhoods have sidewalks with tree canopy and cover. So you can take refuge near a bus stop, for example. Many neighborhoods in outer in the outer areas of Northeast and Southeast Portland just don't have those canopies and that pedestrian and walking environment during the summer. And now that we have 3 months of over 100-degree weather, it's not just one event. It's a very hot summer in Oregon now, so just trying to make it a comfortable walking environment. That was, frankly, my interest. And staff, Kevin, you may have other, Kevin or Bill.
And Kirsten, you didn't mention, maybe you did mention it in a way, the sequestration aspect of trees, I think is an important thing. So
right.
I read
it
that.
Is. I would just say it's related.
Yes.
If it's not the reason.
Yes,
yeah,
no,
thank you.
There's multiple reasons. Yeah. Trees can provide, in addition to aesthetics and cooling, and in a more engaging environment to walking. We're trying to encourage people to walk, and as temperatures get hotter, people aren't going to walk as much. So trees have so much value in addition to the sequestration.
That's right. And trees and sometimes people have to walk. So if people can't afford cars, they're in environments where they have to make long walks. And so this is, again, about trying to protect public health as well.
Absolutely. The only thing I'd add to that is that trees also provide some buffering from vehicular traffic. So there is added comfort and safety for pedestrians in areas provided with a setback sidewalk and street trees.
See, that's a technical answer. Thank you, Kevin. I just know it feels better. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Any follow-up, Stuart?
No, not really. I was thinking along all those lines. And then another thing to add to that is, a narrowing of the view planes along corridors will help slow traffic down as well. There's some really interesting research that I just read about a week ago on that. And there's also some research showing that, the presence of tree canopy has helped with equity in your home because areas that have this tree canopy tend to have higher house costs. So there's also the kind of the opposite thinking there too is, is this, will this help with our affordable housing issue? Or will it create, the CFAs as more of this kind of exclusive zone where it's, more expensive to live. So just some more thinking around that.
And whether or not street trees, whether or not these standards or guidances or incentives would apply just to the climate friendly areas, I'd have to ask Kevin about that right now, but we're thinking too, it really is a matter for the entire community, but I'm not sure our rules reflect that right now, but thank you. Right. So you're not pushing it, making these like privilege zones and then everyone else is suffering. Thank you.
So, Chair, if I might, I just searched the draft rules for the word tree to see where we actually are requiring things. And it looks like in our pedestrian system rules, we are requiring trees it says cities must plan for enhanced tree canopy and other infrastructure that uses natural and living materials in pedestrian spaces in climate-friendly areas and in areas with concentrations of underserved populations. And that's part of the pedestrian system planning to make sure that we have a comfortable, safe pedestrian environment so people walk, just like Kirsten and everyone was just talking about. The only other place we really talk about trees are in our parking rules. and making sure that we're having appropriate shading in large parking lots.
Thanks, Bill. And my only question there wasn't the rationale for the street trees, but just the level of detail. It really goes deep into the detail.
In the parking rules, yeah, and I'll let Evan address that if you'd like to.
Yeah, that's okay. That was just one of the questions, part of my previous questions. Thank you.
And so I think the best way, this is a really important topic for a lot of reasons. So I think we should flag it and then make sure we bring it up specifically next week, so that we both talk about it as a commission, get some public input on it, and then we can perhaps provide some guidance on where we are as a commission in that particular area. So that's why this session is so great, because for me, it's crystallizing some issues, and perhaps that's helpful to staff in terms of how we proceed next week. Other questions besides trees, in addition to trees, I guess, for...
I have to go somewhere for 5 minutes. I just want to tell you that in case you, in the next 5 minutes, want to ask me something. Okay.
We won't call on you. Stuart, your hand is up again. Did you have something additional to say?
Oh yeah, so many things to say, so many questions.
Great. Perfect.
Which is good. My question is one that I sent out to you all last week, and that's really about the connectedness issue we're seeing in a lot of cities. Is there anything in the rules that is telling cities they have to plan for kind of bridging the divide between what I would refer to as historically segregated neighborhoods that were cut off during the building of our highway systems? Are these areas required to provide some sort of connectedness from one neighborhood to the next that may not have that right now?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Warren. We do have requirements in each of our modal requirements for pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and streets to provide for a connected network. There are some exceptions to that for, in residential areas where maybe you've got cut through traffic or something like that, where you still allow that pedestrian bicycle permeability, but maybe you do have a diverter or something like that for motor vehicle traffic. But in terms of specifically about reconnecting neighborhoods, I don't know that we have anything specifically that says that. Now, of course, we have a lot about, looking at underserved neighborhoods or neighborhoods where there's concentrations of underserved populations and making sure you're paying special attention to their needs. I think that this is certainly falls within that bucket, but that doesn't, we haven't enumerated all the different harms that have befallen these neighborhoods over the decades and how to fix each one specifically.
Thanks, Bill. I'll just add to, if one of these areas happens to be a climate-friendly area or under consideration as a climate-friendly area, there is a requirement for a multimodal gap analysis that would look at that issue and require the local government to come up with a plan to address that connectivity, to provide that needed connectivity over time. That's only in that circumstance where there's, you have an underserved area that's a climate-friendly area.
Follow-up questions? Great. Continue.
Good, Chair MacArthur. So yeah, I know Division 12, there's a lot going on there. Well, let's go ahead and move on to Division 44, our scenario planning rules. And this haven't changed a lot in the last few months, but I'll let Cody give an update.
Sure. So we brought this last to the RAC in March of 2021, and we had walkthroughs with Commission in May. And so we have kind of set them aside to put all hands on deck on Division 12. Just a brief thumbnail of Division 44. It's the Metropolitan Greenhouse Gas Reduction Target Rules is the official title there. And we've had it for about a decade now. This came from legislative direction. It's been mandatory for the Portland metro area. It's been voluntary to do the planning to reach these targets for the rest of the metropolitan areas of the state. We've done some cleanup work, technical stuff on, revising the targets and the methodology in the past. And we, in scoping for this rulemaking, we worked really hard with a lot of outreach and engagement, and worked with ODOT to get a really clean charge so we could hit the ground running here. So we identified the funding that it would take, and we proposed to the commission to basically go ahead and make mandatory requirements for the Eugene Springfield area and for the Salem Keizer area. And so if you combined the three largest metropolitan areas of Portland, Eugene, Salem Keizer, that'd be about 50% or more of the state's population would be covered by this program now as mandatory. There are some discretionary review process of which the commission can issue an enforcement order to say, you know, if we think that another area needs to get into this program, there's a list of criteria that you all can use to do that. In the rules, we set out a compliance schedule to do this work. So without going through all the nitty-gritty details, it would be within the next 5 years, we expect to have adopted scenario plan and the conforming TSP, transportation system plan amendments, and comp plan amendments that would implement the scenario plan for Eugene Springfield and Salem Keizer. Eugene Springfield was in the legislation they had back in 2012. They had to develop 2 different scenarios that would reach their target, but they didn't have to adopt that. So they have the scenario on hand, and we've done some work. ODOT and DLCD staff have been working with them to kind of update some of that information prior to this rulemaking. So we put into the rules that they can use one of those scenarios to fulfill that, so that can be a lighter lift for them. They were not interested, from what we've heard in public testimony, in recreating that scenario plan. So that should be a quicker path forward of just coming up with an implementation package for that scenario and adopting it. And then next would be the Salem Keizer area, which would essentially start from scratch. A couple items in here is that we set aside some rules that said, well, in the interim period, before everyone else does a scenario plan, what do you do? And we called that interim scenario planning requirements. It's looking like we're actually probably going to fold that into those major reports into the TPR, so we can kind of just consolidate things. Essentially what that's doing is just providing cities and counties with a gap analysis of where are your adopted plans compared to the STS regional trajectories, which are, you know, the state scenario plan for transportation. Here's where things would have to be at what levels in 2050 to reach our greenhouse gas reduction targets. So more than likely what we're going to do is make some revisions that cleans up and consolidates some of the work we've done in Division 44 into Division 12, specifically in the reporting and monitoring rules. And that just really makes it, I think, a lot cleaner for folks to follow, and really makes for less cross-referencing between divisions. We did get a number of comments that we have, and we're ready to make amendments to this division as well from all the previous work that we've gotten comments from commissioners, RAC members, interested stakeholders. And so we will be coming out in the next RAC meeting with the revised draft of Division 44, and really trying to make sure that we have a clean crosswalk between how that, you know, interacts with the transportation planning rules.
Thank you, Cody. So a question I have, and I think you covered it in general. I'm just trying to figure out in my brain how it all flows. So in the case of Eugene Springfield, because they have already done scenario planning, and the hope is that they engaged sort of the right constituents in that effort, consistent with our equity lens. I don't know if that means they need to do a little bit more outreach or not, but you can comment on that. But let's say they've done that and they have this, they can choose one of the 2 scenario plans that they've evolved. That then is their big conceptual ideas of how then to move into where and how to establish CFAs and system planning and everything else. Is that correct? I mean, in my brain, you do scenario planning first, then you establish the CFAs, and that might work in Eugene Springfield because they have somewhat of they can adopt what they already have on the shelf. So I guess there's two questions here: the equity lens for and those kinds of outcomes in the scenario plans that were already completed for Eugene Springfield, but for the other communities, what is the influence of a scenario plan relative to CFAs and that kind of implementing work that is downstream? How does that trajectory work?
Great questions, Chair MacArthur. So I'll take the first one first is for the kind of the equity lens, the draft rules that we put forth for Division 44 do require a scenario plan to have equitable engagement and to also have the region kind of define what equitable outcomes mean at this like regional scale. So that might be one area where they choose to do some work to say, you know, we'd like to kind of re-engage folks. That is really, they have a work plan proposal in the rules, and so we expect to be, we're already engaged in talks with both of these two regions. So that's just one of the items that we'll have to kind of figure out. Was it sufficient? That was a long time ago. Was that sufficient to meet these requirements, or is it something they'd like to do more work there? So we'll work with them on that. But that would be a performance measure that we'd want to see included in the implementation of that scenario. So for climate friendly areas, I think of the really good corollary is the 2040 plan in Metro. When Metro did the climate smart communities, they relied pretty much part and parcel on the 2040 growth concept. And so that work was done prior to the climate smart strategy. So I kind of think of it in the same way as we're really asking for climate friendly area designation and plan amendments pretty quickly. So that's not going to hinder folks. That's really going to set themselves there. When you go into this work, that's going to set yourself up that you took that bite of the apple and got the land use component that would more than likely be necessary to get to the greenhouse gas reduction target. So that shouldn't be a problem. If anything, it's taking the first step towards getting to the outcomes we want to see.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And so just really clearly then the value add of the, like maybe in a couple of sentences or a couple of bullets, what the value add, because I've been a big proponent of scenario planning, obviously, because I've seen how it can work. In your minds and staff minds, what are the top three value add points for scenario planning?
I think the biggest value add is the flexibility, and it's the ultimate outcomes-based rule. If we're talking about outcomes-based rule, it is, here is, meet a greenhouse gas reduction target and show us, your way of doing that. What's the special mix of options? It gets to the more regional planning that we need to see more cooperation because we have some regional planning, but maybe we need to get a little bit more on, if we're gonna have to push hard, how are we gonna cooperate to do this? We're sharing funds to go up to these regional plans for the Metropolitan Planning Organization. How can we kind of get on board with that? Or maybe one city can take more in one action area that allows the other city a little bit more flexibility in some area. I think that it really just that regional cooperation. Then of course, I think equity also, you have housing costs and transportation costs are closely related. So we're having more of a comprehensive conversation of housing and transportation at the regional scales and really setting a vision plan for the region to go about and then implementing changes to their transportation system plans and comprehensive plans.
That is really helpful. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Cody, could I just add one piece to that? And correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the things I've learned as I've worked on this effort is that transit providers are generally not restricted to city boundaries. They're a regional agency. And so scenario planning is one way, particularly in Eugene Springfield with LTD, where you can really, it's a better tool for engaging transit in that larger conversation.
Yeah, I think that it's a large tent that is cast there or during those processes. And health outcomes, we've worked with Oregon Health Authority to do the health impact assessments, and they've signaled that they're willing to keep doing that for us so we can look at health outcomes from different scenarios. And so we really bring a lot more tools to bear and a lot, more things to discover and thinking about how are we going to get to 2050.
Nick?
Just one follow-up question for Cody, or maybe it's for anybody on the team, and that is if you're hearing anything from particularly cities, LOC maybe, regarding implementing all the program elements for the CFAs once the CFAs are identified within a year. I just it's going to coincide with implementing Senate Bill 762, the big omnibus wildfire bill, among so many other things. And I think about some jurisdictions would have staffing issues and permitting demands are significant. And I'm addressing these issues is absolutely critical. I'm just wondering if you're hearing that is a year sufficient, or is there any thought of, let's aim for a year, but there's a 6-month extension. I want this to work for cities in particular, counties as well, but cities are going to be the primary entity. Thanks.
Sure, Commissioner Lilac, I can speak to that. And the rules have not been out. The latest iteration has not been out for a terribly long time. I think it's fair to say we've received kind of feedback thus far, kind of on both sides of the issue. Some are saying, hey, the sooner we act, the sooner it makes a difference to get local governments to act more quickly. That's all true, but we also understand limited resources and there's a lot on local government's plate. So just to be clear, so the latest rules on CFA implementation or climate-friendly area implementation would have local governments designating climate-friendly areas within basically a year following rule adoption. So by the end of June 2023. And that will entail basically drawing the line saying these are the areas we think will be, or areas we think will be our climate-friendly area or areas. And also doing some analysis of potential of basically fair and equitable housing outcomes, looking at the potential for displacement, identifying mitigation tools if that's looking like it's warranted. So that's all the work that would be done within the first year. Then the rules allow one additional year for the local governments to actually adopt the zoning, regulations that would apply within climate-friendly areas. And there are basically two approaches. One is a more prescriptive. Here's a very limited, pared down set of standards that local governments could adopt as development standards within climate-friendly areas, or another more outcomes-oriented approach that really gets at are rules sufficient to get at employment and residential development in significant concentration to really achieve our goals in climate-friendly areas? And certainly we've heard from some local governments that, yeah, really this would take more time for us. And I think we'll have to continue to balance the need for urgency with some of the pragmatic considerations from local governments.
Follow-up question, Nick? No? Okay. Other commissioners have questions? I think this is another topic that we should flag and raise and talk a little more about at our public hearing, the timeframe to adopt CFAs. I think it's useful to highlight it, hear the rationale, and then just kind of leave it open for the public to feel welcome to participate in that conversation. Stuart?
Yeah, sorry, I had to step away to use the restroom really quick. It sounds like we're on CFAs at this point. So my big question around CFAs is, how are we considering generational wealth through this process? Has any of that been a consideration? Just to kind of bring my own brain into the conversations that may have been had behind the scenes, because I think it's a really important part of obviously equity in this process. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner Warren, and it is definitely something we've thought about. So the first set of rules for climate-friendly areas had more than one housing type as a housing type that would be permitted in a climate-friendly area. It included both multifamily development, which I'll say generally a rule of thumb is 5 or more units, dwelling units on a property. At least that's how I tend to think of multifamily. It also included attached single family. And so that could be a row house or, that kind of paradigm. The distinction is a row house, if it's constructed on an individual lot with a shared wall, can be more easily an ownership type of housing. And that type of housing can build generational wealth. The latest draft pulled that out. And the reason for that, frankly, is looking at the densities that we're wanting to achieve in these areas. It would be challenging to allow for row housing, or at least we believe it would be challenging to do that and to achieve the level of employment and housing that we would like to see in these mixed-use walkable areas. That said, and I will note there are other ways that ownership can be supported within a multifamily context, condominiums, that sort of thing. We know there are complications with that. It's not a simple solution. But we're trying to balance the intensity that we need to see within these walkable mixed-use areas with that very issue. So certainly this isn't the final word on what permitted uses make sense in a climate-friendly area, but that's the thinking that's kind of underscored the permitted housing types.
It made me think of, in the Pearl District, do you guys know that townhouse project that's pretty dense? Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Well, there's a lot of development there. I'm not sure.
There's a lot of
which one.
Yeah, but in the Pearl District, there's a block. I'm trying to think of which street it was. I'm not very good with streets. I was like near the Rite Aid. There's a whole block that's very intensely developed.
Lovejoy.
Yeah, somewhere around there, intensely developed as townhomes, like kind of brick with alleys behind them. I guess my question would be, I could imagine when people think of townhomes, they think of like a suburban version of that, like townhomes all over the place, spread out. There is a very walkable, transit-oriented neighborhood that we have now that's, I would consider a climate-friendly area that has a good density of townhomes. So that could be a good example if one needs to figure out at what density do those occur.
You bet. I'll just say one of the sources I've been using is this. You may be familiar with visualizing density, which is something that was produced by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and kind of looks at residential densities across the country and different housing types. But again, if there's other data or information sources that would suggest that we should broaden.
Yeah. I think of Boston, like a good portion of downtown Boston is intensive brownstones, so I just think we're thinking of townhomes in a not as dense way as they occur in many cities. You think of Amsterdam. There's just so many cities that have that great Washington, D.C. So I think we shouldn't limit our thought on missing middle housing to like what we have currently in the city.
Commissioner Warren, did that get at your question? Your question is a very deep one. It's a very big question.
Yeah, I think it definitely does. I mean, I've been trying to think outside of like the normal generational wealth building capacity that we see in, home owning or land owning kind of situation. One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is kind of this live work sort of space where you may, rent or own the space, but you can also, conduct business there, which is really important for a lot of folks who are trying to kind of lift themselves up to have that space to be able to do their work kind of at home and not have to pay for maybe two sort of buildings. And of course, that comes back down to allowing for the mixed use development type stuff. But from my understanding, we don't have any like requirements necessarily for mixed use development within necessarily, like saying like, okay, 30% of your CFA has to be mixed use. We just say, you could use mixed use development to kind of accomplish this sort of a thing. So I just wanted to put that kind of thought out there, to look beyond the typical generational wealth building capacities that we've been utilizing for so long and try to include maybe something. And I don't know how that looks at this point in time, but how do we really try to think outside the box on this? Because I think it's a really important part of trying to lift up folks who may not qualify to own a place for who knows how long.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think and specifically in Oregon, if you just limit these home ownership opportunities to be multi-story or multi-family looking, let's say, you because of our condo law, we don't get a lot of those until our condo law changes in Oregon. We're not going to get home ownership opportunities in a stacked configuration as much as we would like, and so it really leaves home ownership to this missing middle housing, which like I said, I think it can occur in an appropriate density. The project I was talking about is on 11th and Hoyt, just so you can see kind of that how it can be very urban dense on a streetcar line, that kind of thing.
So I feel like I should just clarify. Thank you. This is really an interesting line of inquiry, but I just want to be clear, just for everyone's understanding. The current rules, Commissioner Warren is correct. Current rules do not require any mixture of uses. So it essentially says you need to allow for mixed uses. You can do mixed uses within a building, or you can, if you want to do 100% housing or 100% an office building, that would be permissible. Some commenters have said, well, maybe we should require a mix of development, mixed uses on each site. I think the concern is that what we don't want to do is overly prescribe for the market what needs to be built, and in doing so, maybe preclude some types of development that would really overall support what we'd want to see within that climate friendly area. So again, just sharing the thinking in terms of the current draft.
That's really helpful. And I think Stuart's question is really a good one, as we've all mentioned. And I think that there are a lot of things, there are some things we can do, and I think staff is doing that, and perhaps there's more things we can look at to do through zoning, planning, and transportation. But this conversation has to include the implementation levers as well, which is certainly investment in transportation, the right investment in housing, and SDCs. I mean, there's all sorts of tools that a local jurisdiction might have to then to deal with the inequities. So they're not, we can't solve this problem through zoning. We can solve the zoning piece of that through our rules, perhaps, or at least address it, not solve it yet, because this is, these are rules that allow development to happen, not make it. So how I see it playing out is that next week we start that conversation with fellow directors on implementation. And to me, there's a strong parallel track that we should be evolving. It's not a one-off conversation with these directors. There's EQC money potentially for this kind of thing. There's, Margaret Salazar has money. There's transportation. There's other kinds of resources. So I would like to think about Stuart's question in the context of how to evolve the panel conversation next week into a parallel track for implementation that we take up again in early February and March. And not necessarily put those into our rules, but indicate that there is a whole array of things we have to be doing to address these issues. So we can talk about that next week, but that's kind of want to plant that seed. Other questions from commissioners on this particular point? We have about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure staff has enough time to go through the rest of this, and then leave just about 4 minutes at the end to highlight. I'll indicate the issues that I think we have talked about. We haven't deliberated on them, but sort of highlighted some things that we want to have more conversation and cross-commissioner conversation, as well as input from the public at our November meeting. So why don't we let staff continue and leave a little bit of time at the end.
Thank you, Chair MacArthur. It's been very interesting to listen to this. Real quickly, I'm going to talk about give you an update on our community conversations that we held in October. We held a series of 4 community conversations with folks in metropolitan areas across the state. Altogether, probably about 200 participants. altogether at those. We did put a recording of one of those meetings up on the agency's YouTube channel in case you're interested in taking a look at how that went. Answer a lot of questions, got a lot of comments and feedback. I just want to praise Evan Manville for a lot of his work putting those together and coordinating those and getting those off the ground. The rest of us were busy, I was busy, just heads down on rules and getting the packet out. And I stood up for air, and then I had to go to a bunch of committee conversations, which are already all set up for me, which was great. So thank you, Evan, for that. Anything else that you want to add to that, Evan, or anyone else on staff? And I would like to thank commissioners for your participation in those meetings as well when you were able to show up and participate. Hopefully that was useful for you. So the last thing we have on our staff report are our key discussion items that we expect to discuss with you at your meeting next week. And yeah, thank you, Esther. So there's 3 of them, and I know we just have a limited amount of time left, so I just want to kind of give the overview of what each of those are, and before we have any questions or comments about the details of those. The first one is, there was a lot of discussion, I think, at the last commission meeting about, are requirements too prescriptive, or we want to do more prescriptive versus outcome based, and a lot of people ask, you had a lot of public comment about this, and I think commissioners had some good questions like, so what do you mean by that? And there was a lot of we're not quite sure. So I'll say Cody did a good job of identifying some places where we have some outcomes based requirements that are in the draft rules, and presented here for the commission to take a look at and see. These are some things that we have where they're not super prescriptive, and then this is examples of places where we have these, and maybe we can do some more of these things in other places, or this is to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So that's one thing. The other thing is we want to talk about timing of transportation system plan updates. I'll say the existing rules don't give a lot of guidance to local governments about how frequently transportation system plans should be updated. And Esther, this is on page 10. And I think the draft rules as they're written don't necessarily go a lot further than the existing rules on that either. And I think there's been a lot of public comment and a discussion among staff about, gee, we need to have some urgency. We need to, act quickly with some of these things. Can we afford to wait for some of these transportation system plans to be updated 5-10 years down the road from now to meet updated requirements? And so I think we'll want to have a discussion with the commission about their feelings around that. There are obviously issues around being able to support those updates through state money. Many of them are already supported through Transportation Growth Management Program or other funding from the state. We have a couple of large cities that have very recent transportation system plans that and I always kind of get frustrated when we reinvent the wheel. Spend a lot of money to do something that we already had. So trying to avoid that piece. So I think those are things that we'll need to talk about as well. And the last kind of catch all on page 11 is just kind of a general thumbs up, thumbs down, right track, wrong track. How are we doing with some of this stuff? And we've had some discussion today, but obviously you haven't been able to provide us any direction today, and that'll be your opportunity to do that next week about where do you think we're doing a good job, and that we maybe need to focus on some other pieces because we've got a lot of rules, and we're going to be able to focus on a subset of them to really make sure that we're dialed in correctly. And it'd be great to get I think we have some ideas about that. I know members of the public have their range of ideas about that. It'd be great to hear from the commission as well about where you think we need to pay some more attention and focus in the stretch here. So before we get to adoption. So Chair, I'll hand it back to you if you want. There's something specific about these pieces you would like to talk about. Happy to do that.
Great, thank you, Bill. This is a really good summary. I'd forgotten that you had this nice key discussion themes at the end of the staff report. It's pages 9 through 11 for the folks that haven't tuned into it yet of the staff report for agenda item number 7. So comments, questions for Bill and the team on these specifics before we kind of maybe add, I think some of the topics we discussed earlier in this, or we didn't discuss them, we raised questions. We might want to add some of those things, those specifics to here so that it helps staff kind of guide the agenda or prepare the agenda for next week. But questions about what Bill just went over in those couple of pages of summary themes. Nick?
Yeah, thank you, Chair MacArthur. The question I would just ask is, Bill or anybody on the team, are you able to maybe just at the highest level possible also just capture the public input we've received to this point on whether we're on the right track or wrong track? As commissioners, we'll have opinions next week, but I'm just curious if next week you might be able to summarize the public's perspectives as well from what you've heard to this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Lilac. So we've asked after each advisory committee, we send out a survey to our members of the advisory committee and the alternates to give us feedback, and we've asked for them to give us that by this upcoming Monday, the 15th. So next week we'll have had that in our hands for a few days, and hopefully Cody and I and some other folks maybe can sit down and try to figure out what the themes are there. I'll say, a lot of the feedback we've received in dribs and drabs over email, heavily talking about implementation and not so much the rules themselves, but like resources for implementation and making sure that local governments are going to be able to do this thing. Broadly, I'd say, that people are supportive. Obviously, there's some outliers there, but, folks are supportive of what we're trying to do. I think it's just a matter of dialing in those details of how are we actually going to do this? Is it going to be implemented? Are we actually going to be able to get there? That seems to be a lot of the broad concern. And I welcome other staff if you have other things to say as well.
I would just say thanks, Bill. I appreciate your comments now, and I think it'd be great to hear next week as well once you have had the opportunity to review the comments by then. Very helpful. And I think it's helpful for, especially at a commission meeting, for the broader public that may be watching live or later to hear those perspectives as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Stuart, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to what Nick said. I found those polls in the RAC meeting last week really helpful. It's kind of on the spot. What are you folks thinking about how we're doing? I'm not sure how well that plays into kind of the broader perspective of where we're at. And I'll certainly leave that to you to decide on that. But for me, I thought that there were some interesting kind of viewpoints being expressed through some of those polls. Thank you.
Great. And I guess I would encourage you, staff, to and you can certainly give us whatever you want to give us, but I think it's easier for you to articulate some of the themes you see emerging, not just from polls, but in addition to other conversations you've had, to just articulate the top ones, because you guys are the experts on that, in both reaching out to locals to get input, but also trying to figure out how to frame that for the commission. Any kind of final questions about what Bill just said? And then I wanted to offer commissioners a chance to add issues that we've talked about. I can summarize a few that I heard, but I want to make sure we give staff a list of those to highlight in the context of their presentation next week. Seeing no other hands. Well, the list I have, and again, I think it'll fit neatly under some of the things you just outlined, Bill, but we talked about trees, we talked about parking requirements, specificity of requirements, time frame to adopt the CFAs. Anya brought up some really good questions about how do we envision communities integrating the House Bill 2001 work with this effort. I've heard in other contexts, and we heard today the idea of local resources for the local jurisdictions, both to plan and adopt the rules in a timely manner, but also the resources to implement. And I think that's a big conversation. Again, we'll start that with the commissioner, with the fellow directors next week, but I think there's real room for us to talk about a lot of different areas. And I'm not asking for additional research on the part of staff. That's not what I'm saying. I think this is probably a director and Kirsten conversation to kind of figure out how do we pull together some of the resources from other jurisdiction, other state agencies to help implement this work. So, and that will get at some of the issues that Stuart, you raised about equity and historic ways of being that need to be thrown out and changed and everything else. I am assuming I missed a lot of the other points or nuanced discussions. So please, commissioners, add to that list.
Yeah, I just think,
yeah, go ahead.
I think one thing that, just to reiterate again is really clarifying the fact that you can have multiple CFAs. For some reason, I feel like that's something that's been missed a lot in our conversations. Probably just because you all work in it so often and it's clear to you, but I think reiterating that will be really helpful for these folks to implement the rules that we need them to implement, instead of forcing them, hopefully to not just think in one area, which is going to be mostly downtowns, but allowing them to have this additional thought process of like, okay, what else can we include in this? So yeah, thank you.
Great. Yeah, great point. Thank you. I didn't capture that well. Kirsten.
I didn't mean to cut other commissioners off, Chair MacArthur, and so certainly interested if the other commissioners have anything to add to your great list. I would just note that House Bill 2001 and probably 2003 integrated with this work with respect to the housing protection strategies and community stabilization strategies. So super important. I know you probably meant that. And then the technical support team, I did just want to get a shout out. So as we think about this parallel implementation track, Chair MacArthur, Cody has, in his spare time, has been supporting this interagency technical support team, which is really a great vehicle to kind of formalize and continue this discussion. Granted, that's been at sort of the staff level, not the director level. So I think kind of re-chartering what all that looks like here in the next few months will be a really, really, really important opportunity, really to stand up something that is, probably about a 5-year time frame. Before, as we are headed into implementation and then looking at, obviously we'll need to be revising the rules at some point because we won't get it all right, but just some kind of steering body that is super high level to help direct and support the staff work to continue this programmatic support to cities and counties as they implement. Thank you. And sorry to go off camera. My internet is low. Thank you.
No, Kirsten, those are excellent points. And I thanks for the reminder of all the work Cody and the other folks have been doing on the implementation front. I didn't mean that you weren't doing anything on that. I just didn't want to plot more work effort on top of what you're already doing. But yes, you're right. It's Cody has been working with other agencies, especially with ODOT, but others as well. So I'm not trying to plop on that work. I think we should highlight that and figure out what role commission and director and deputy director might have in promoting that direction. So thank you.
That'll be really helpful. That will be really a helpful move, Chair. Thank
you. Nick.
Just one other question, and it's not so much for now, but it's really for Steve. Just going forward is. I've had at least one city attorney even ask me the question of, so what is the legal basis for doing this work for LCDC? The legislature didn't direct it. This is a governor's executive order. Isn't LCDC intended to implement legislation? And, so, and again, not for Steve to answer the question now, but just to be prepared, I have heard that question come up both in the community and, like I said, even from a city attorney in our region. So just so you're aware of it.
And for my clarification, I thought in theory we could do anything we wanted. It's just that we might not have the resources to back up the work. In other words, we have our own agenda also, right, of things that we want to do and have planned to do, but don't necessarily have a bill or something tied to it financially. I might be making that up. That's why I'm throwing it out.
This is a good one, Chair and Vice Chair, if you don't mind. This is really a good one for us to hit proactively. I think to Commissioner Lelak's point is let's lead with this where DLCD's authority is, because really everything does stem from that. So I think it's a good refresher on our statutes, and Steve does help keep us within the rails on a weekly basis, but we do have limits, Vice Chair. Unfortunately, we only have limited authority within the state structure.
Yeah, I know. That was an exaggeration. I just meant like, it doesn't always have to be that one line. It doesn't appear from what I know to this date that it has to be, it's just that our funding is tied in a way that makes it difficult.
Well, if we want to, if we truly this is just such a great point. I'm sorry to underscore it so heavily and triple underscore it, but we can only do things in our authority with or without the funding. So we definitely want to lead off with that. So thanks, Commissioner Lilac, for the suggestion, and Vice Chair for amplifying that in terms of the resources. Right, we have more authority than resources. We'll put it that way.
Yes, within our authority, I would like to clarify as Vice Chair of the Commission that it's only things within our authority. And I exaggerated to make it sound to say basically that it's not just from one source,
right,
and that it's usually tied to funding.
Exactly. Thank you. Well put.
I thought you were describing what the agendas might look like should you become chair in May.
No. It's a joke. Joke. Don't quote it. Don't put it in the paper. It's a joke.
Steve, I don't know if you need to want to handle that now, but I do appreciate Kirsten's point and the question that we should reflect on that as part of the conversation next week.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And as Kirsten mentioned, we do have, okay, how are we doing that? So, we do keep that in mind.
Well, I'm particularly aware of the question given where it came from, an attorney. And I think it's useful for us to understand that, because I don't know, and I don't want to imply the intent, but sometimes when attorneys ask questions, they're looking for ways to push back on what we do. So I just want to be really careful about the way we respond to that in a public setting next week. Again, this has been really, really helpful to me. I'm really glad we had this work session. And I think it actually, quite frankly, helps in a way that we were constrained to just ask questions because I just think it's really, really helpful. And I know it's an extra lift for you guys, the CFEC team, guys and gals, but thank you. It's been very, very useful, I think, for all of us. Any parting comments from other staff, other commissioners?
Yeah, if I may, Chair, I just want to kind of reiterate that, kind of what you said, that these rules are really big and there's a lot to them, and it's really easy for us to get caught in the weeds, especially during conversation or deliberation. And so I think just having a bit of grace for that moving forward is really important for what we're doing, and not necessarily just to make us look like a united front, but to really embrace each other's opinions and ability to question what it is we're doing, because I really feel like this is important, and it might be kind of a once in our lifetime sort of an opportunity to address some of these important issues. And I think we all need to recognize that, because I'm just coming to that awareness, I think, in the last couple of weeks, that really how big this rulemaking is. And so I think just having that grace for ourselves that what we're doing is big and it's new and it's going to make changes, and we're going to have some upset people no matter what we do with it. But I think how we approach it approach and respond, I should say, is what really is going to make this important.
Well said, Stuart. Thank you.
And I was going to say the alignment, like we've been talking with the other departments, the alignment with our other rulemaking demonstrates that this is the way that planning of 2021, needs to occur. We're at these are things that we've been talking about for a long time and are kind of embedded already by the nature of our urban growth boundaries. And, these values exist since, the 70s, but now we're updating it for our modern day, electric vehicle charging and then equity considerations that obviously were suppressed during that time period, right? So I think it's an extension of what we were intended to do, but for now, to address the needs of now. So I think that's important. And the more that it's encompassing of all the state, what we do in the whole state, the more successful it'll be.
Agreed. Final remarks? Not seeing any more hands up or hearing anything. Thank you again, staff. Great work. Really, really terrific work. We'll let you go and see you next, I guess next Thursday or Friday. I forget which, but one of those days. We'll see you then.
Thanks, Commissioners. Thank you, Chair.
Take care.